Good morning. We're very pleased to have Professor Fernand de Varennes here today with us. You're teaching a human rights course at our university, and it's a great pleasure to have you here. Your list of accomplishments are almost too large to recount in their full number. You're a visiting professor and professor in Australia, I think China, Hong Kong,
South Africa, a few other places.
And numerous other places, and you're the editor, I believe, of a prestigious human rights journal as well in Asia. So you're really a leading authority on human rights, and again, it's an honor to have you here at the university.
Thank you for having me.
And so what are your impressions of Kaunas and of Lithuania?
Well, I haven't had time to visit much yet. I've only been here about a week and a half, and quite busy during that period.
Sure.
But certainly I'm looking forward to coming back and experience the area, not in winter, let's put it that way, although it's not as so cold in this country.
Yeah, it's actually been relatively mild
That's
the last week or so, and hopefully it will stay that way during the length of your visit. But again, it's a great benefit for our students, for you to teach here.
Thank you.
I do have some questions for you from really the faculty collectively about various human rights issues, some general and some specifically pertaining to issues that are current in Lithuania. The first question I have is regarding just generally human rights and the concept of human rights inflation, we could say, or adding various items to the list of human rights. And can there be too much human rights? Is that a possibility? Do you see any danger in that?
Well, I think you have to be a little bit careful as to this concept of human rights inflation. I'm actually not sure it exists in terms of international human rights law. I think we have to distinguish between human rights that exist in international law and human rights that is practiced in different countries. Human rights in different countries is not the same thing necessarily as human rights in international law. Now, in international law, what we're dealing with are basic fundamental human rights.
Right.
And in that area, I don't think we have a degree of inflation. As a matter of fact, I think it's quite difficult for many governments to accept even basic human rights in international law. And so that what you tend to find at the international level, international human rights law, are minimal basic guarantees of human rights. And even at that, we have only very weak mechanisms to implement those human rights. Because when we talk about human rights, once again, from the point of view of international law, we're talking about human rights against government. And that may sound a bit strange, but the main violator, the party that breaches human rights in international law is actually the state, the government. And in reality, the governments have only been willing to accept treaties, human rights, that are rather basic, with not too demanding mechanisms. So that in reality, when we talk about what I consider real human rights in international law, there's not a huge amount of inflation, because what you're dealing with are basic human rights by and large. So unless you have a specific example of a kind of inflation, I'm not sure what you describe is really a problem at the international level.
Sure. Maybe it's not in the category of inflation, but I guess we could talk about certain types of conflicts with, I guess you can call it cultural relativism, in the sense that if there's a right to marriage, does it include, gay and lesbian marriage? And those types of perhaps conflicts, or talk about rights of disabled people, and then rights of unborn, or fetuses with disabilities. So with those types of kind of collisions,
I think at the international level there are not as many collisions as you think, as you may believe, or some people may believe. Because, for example, quite recently, in fact this week, in the United Kingdom, they have adopted, I believe, a law which recognizes gay marriages, I believe. But in international law, it's not so clear that that would be a human right. We don't have any treaties that say that that two men or two women can actually legally marry. And so, therefore, is it a human right in international law? Well, I'm not so sure about that. Remember, what we recognize at the international level are only basic rights. And whereas in the United Kingdom, for example, they're willing to go in that direction, as has Canada, and I think Brazil and a few other countries, not quite sure that that would be necessarily the same thing in international law, only because human rights in international law are fundamental, pretty basic.
I understand. Yeah.
Okay.
One other issue regarding this, the same theme, I suppose, was the concept of animal rights, and I've seen appear not necessarily here, but in other curriculums, even animal rights law. And how do you view that as a professor of human rights? Do you view that as something possibly related, as an extension, or just something?
I hope I don't sound like a broken record, but once again, you have to distinguish what happens in some countries. What they consider to be a right, and what actually is a human right in international law. In terms of human rights treaties, we only have a number of legal documents, a certain number of legal documents recognizing human rights in international law. None of them refer to animals, clearly.
Right.
What we do have are treaties on the protection of the environment or the protection of certain species of animals. But those legal documents in international law don't give animals rights as subjects of law. They're objects of protection. And that's a difference we recognize in international law. Once again, one needs to be careful. The way certain countries, certain jurisdictions, certain governments present rights is not necessarily the same thing as human rights in international law. Human rights in international law, more basic, deals with individuals, very clearly limited to fundamental areas, doesn't go in the direction of animal rights at this current time.
Okay. A more specific issue in Lithuania today is the issue of dual citizenship.
Oh, yeah.
And right now, the policy is that it's generally not permitted in Lithuania, dual citizenship. And I wanted to ask you your views on that general issue about the concept of dual citizenship. Is that a kind of right of an individual to have that, or is that something really more left completely to the states to determine as they see fit?
Actually, neither. Not exactly. First of all, in international law, it's quite clear, there's been even a number of international decisions that indicate that the attribution of citizenship falls within the prerogative, if you will, the discretion of the states. So it's for each government, each country, to decide, do you want dual citizenship, multiple citizenship, or only one citizenship, as long as you respect international law. And that's the qualifier. So on the one hand, it is for the government to decide how a citizenship or what kind of citizenship is attributed, but you cannot do it in a way that would violate, for example, basic human rights. And the difficulty, so it means if Lithuania only wants to recognize a single citizenship, that's fine, as long as you do it in a non-discriminatory way. And that's the real issue. There have been a few, not many, but a few cases of discrimination. If you allow some people to have dual citizenship, which even Lithuania does, by the way, then it has to be without discrimination. And if you start discriminating, then international human rights law can kick in and actually change or modify your requirement if it is discriminatory. You cannot discriminate and say only white people can become citizens of Lithuania. That is racial discrimination, and the government would be slapped very quickly in international law. So one has to ask the question, first of all, is it true that Lithuania only allows one citizenship? Actually, it's not. There are exceptions. Sure. The next question is, are those exceptions discriminatory, or do they violate some other human right in international law? So you see, so in other words, it's not only that the government can decide citizenship. The general rule is yes, but you still have to respect international human rights.
Sure.
The other phenomenon, and there is a phenomenon that's been happening in the last decades, is in reality more and more countries are opening up citizenship in the sense that more and more countries are accepting dual or multiple citizenships. I think only allowing individuals to be the citizens of one country is a kind of a closed door approach. I think with the world, even globalization being what it is, people move around, work, live, marry across borders more and more. And so I think what has been happening as this greater movement of people around the world, opening up of borders, increasingly so. Even China is no longer closed as it used to be. More and more governments are actually allowing dual citizenship. Countries like the United States, for example, are more flexible now in terms of dual or multiple citizenship than it was 20 years ago. Australia does allow dual citizenship, although sometimes people think it does not. It does. I actually hold dual Australian and Canadian citizenship. There are restrictions. If you're born in Australia, you're supposed to only have Australian citizenship. In my case, I emigrated to Australia, so I had Canadian citizenship first, which meant I can keep both. And that, I think, is the direction of the future for most countries. So without entering into the debate, which I know is occurring here in Lithuania, and I'm not aware of all of the nuances here, so I can't really comment too much, I think you have to look at it in the broader perspective. And the broader perspective around the world is increasingly the concept of only allowing one citizenship seems to be a restrictive concept. And increasingly countries are allowing dual or a multiple citizenship even.
And what are the advantages for states to do that? I mean, obviously you notice the trend in that direction. And so what would be an advantage for a state to be very flexible?
Yeah, I think there probably are a number of advantages. One has to think that, especially in the case of, how would I say, very qualified, highly mobile, well-educated individuals, they may actually live and work across borders a lot. So it makes sense that not to want to give up those people necessarily, the connection with those people, and recognize what has become an increasing reality. That especially in the case of highly qualified, well-educated people working across borders, they actually have connections to more than one country. And perhaps to keep that, you have to allow a bit more flexibility in terms of citizenship also. Perhaps. That's probably one of the reasons.
No, sure. One specific example that made the news regarding one of Lithuania's neighbors was the French actor Gerard Depardieu taking Russian citizenship, essentially, I guess, for tax purposes. I don't know if you have any particular thoughts on that case.
Oh, I think it was an interesting case, but let's look at it in a practical way. That does show that perhaps one should allow, for different reasons, a multiple citizenship. And I think in the context of Europe, we should add also that at the same time as for European Union countries, at the same time as you are a citizen of your own specific country, you also have EU citizenship. I mean, the concept of EU citizenship does exist. So already here in Europe, I think there's generally an acceptance that in addition to being a citizen of Europe, you can and must be also the citizen of a specific country. So I think we should look at it in a flexible way. And Depardieu had his own reasons for doing what he did. I think that's a rather unusual case.
Sure. Just newsworthy, I suppose.
Very newsworthy, indeed.
Again, focusing on Lithuania and a specific issue that's happening here is that there is a significant minority population of Polish people. And what's more is that not only is there a significant minority, but they are concentrated in a particular area outside of Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania. And one of the issues that they've had is in these communities, these local communities, where they in fact may form a majority of a particular village, over 50%, they would like to have street signs, for example, in both Polish and Lithuanian. I wonder if you can comment that in terms of a minority rights issue and also a human rights issue.
I think, well, for one thing, Lithuania has ratified a treaty, the Framework Convention on the Protection of National Minorities. And in that treaty, there actually is a provision that talks about signs. And in reality, that provision indicates that where you have a substantial minority that is concentrated, then states must endeavor to actually have signs in their language also. Now the language is a bit odd, and I know the Constitutional Court here in Lithuania has commented on that. I believe the Constitutional Court is incorrect, by the way. It is quite clear that Lithuania, by having accepted that treaty, legal document in international law, has accepted certain obligations. And because it accepted these obligations, one of them involving signs, if you have, as you describe, communities in Lithuania, around Vilnius, where you have a substantial number of people who speak the Polish language, where they're concentrated, and might even be the majority, the government of Lithuania has actually already accepted that they have an obligation. So, I mean, to be very clear, there's a treaty, there's the obligation. The circumstances, I think, are clear enough that you have a substantial number. You yourself said they might even be a majority in some communities. Well, the answer is there. There is that document, which has created legal rights, which the government of Lithuania should move towards respecting.
Going back to globalization and looking at that issue at a broader level, there's been, as you commented, huge migrations, obviously, throughout history and even in the European Union, since the countries of Eastern Europe have joined the European Union. Large numbers of Poles, Lithuanians, other Eastern Europeans have went to England, for example, and reside in London. And when we talk about migrations of people, or people moving to different countries for work, and they do make up a majority or a significant number of a particular neighborhood, would those concepts still apply in terms of having, street signs and
no, you have a bit of a problem there. I referred to a specific treaty in Europe, the Framework Convention. And the problem is that treaty only deals with national minorities. Now, there's debate, there's some disagreement, but it seems that a national minority in the context of Europe only, I'm only talking about Europe, and that treaty refers to historical traditional groups. So the Polish minority here, I would say the Russian minority in Estonia, could claim, although there was some movement in Estonia, more recent, but they could claim that they are historical national minorities. In the case of Lithuanians in London or Poles in Ireland, for example, they're simply not. So that specific treaty would not allow the Polish minority in Ireland, which is quite large, well, in total numbers, to claim the right to signs, street signs in their language. The treaty is very clear. It only deals with national minorities. That's one problem. Secondly, despite what you just said, in reality, if you look at the percentage in Ireland of Polish people, are they really a high percentage in any city? Actually, not really. They tend to be spread out, quite a few of them in Dublin, admittedly, but are they 10% of the Dublin population? No, the answer is no. So even if you could say that they're a national minority, there's a numerical threshold that you have to apply, which refers to a percentage in a certain area. It's not always close, clear what percentage. There are, in fact, some decisions of the committee of experts that works on that treaty. You need to be probably more than 10% of a community to be able to actually claim that kind of right. So, in reality, the problem would not exist under that treaty as such in Europe, because in fact they don't have the numbers and they're not national minorities.
Sure, so they wouldn't qualify.
Well, not in that category. But if I could just add one comment, it does not mean that you have no rights as a migrant. You do. You have human rights as a migrant. And in it, there are cases, including in the United States, by the way, that under the Equality, or what's it called? There's a special Civil Rights Act. I think it's called Chapter 7 or Chapter 6, where on the basis of discrimination and non-discrimination, where you have a concentration of migrants in large enough numbers that there is an obligation for federal institutions to provide some services in their language. Not many people realize that. But that means, for example, that in federal elections, in parts of California, you can vote in Spanish. In fact, there's even a city in California where you can vote in Iranian, in Farsi. Why? Because it happens that in that town, a lot of Iranian immigrants actually went there. and they're more than, let's say, 5% of the population, under federal legislation, to act in a non-discriminatory way, this migrant population has the right to services in their own language, including the right to have voting materials in Farsi. Well, you know what? I think that's reasonable. I think that makes sense when you have a large enough group of migrants. They should have access to some services in their own language when it's reasonable and practicable. And that is what is done in the US. And that also does exist in a number of other countries which look at this issue.
Professor Varennes, thank you for a really fascinating discussion and very interesting answers to some very topical issues in Lithuania, some of which involve international law and also human rights.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Good day.
Thanks.
Cheers.